home. It seems a man will go to any length to establish and defend his home, a safe refuge for his family, for him, his very own castle. The first settlers of this place, they went to great lengths to make this their home. These were the men from Amesbury, Massachusetts. Now, that first settlement failed. The proprietors sent a few men here to claim this town and to lay out house lots. Then, in 1741, they sent a few more men. However, before anyone could inhabit this village, it was burnt to the ground by Indians. This was the right place. It just wasn't the right time. The hostilities between the English and the French and their Indian allies, well, for settlers, it just wasn't safe to be out on the frontier.
Our Abenaki warriors were eager to defend our well-established homes as well.
Your vicious and vigorous defense of this area kept us away for over a generation. It wasn't until 1761 that Daniel Annis and Reuben Kimball crossed over the Kentucky River from Hopkinton and settled this wilderness. We folks from Amesbury soon followed.
Our Abenaki ancestors lived here and cared for this land for over 12,000 years. When you followed the trail that we created and came to the falls on the river, you encountered a well-managed land rich with resources. You used the clearings we made to make our fields. You reaped the bounty of the nut trees that were planted near our village. We named the river Pagantikuk, meaning place of the nut tree. You found and used the soapstone quarry, the soapstone outcropping that we quarried, and you even found the clay that we used to make our pots. You noted the underbrush that we burnt away, and you named a nearby hill Burnt Hill because of it. You even retained the name Shudak, which means in our language, the burnt place.
It is true what she says. We did pick this place for its riches. Now, there are some who want to give credit to God alone for preparing this place for us to settle in the wilderness. Well, perhaps we can acknowledge and should acknowledge those who lived here before us, those people that settled here first. Now, there was another reason I had my eye on the falls: water to power mills. That was one resource the Abenaki could not harness, this river that we call the Amesbury.
You tried to master the river, not work with it. Your travels would have been so much safer if you had paddled in a canoe rather than try to force your horses across the river. Perhaps fewer of you would have drowned.
What an odd pronouncement. We did master the river, as much as any river can be mastered. Listen, in 1764, before I built my house, before I brought my family here from Amesbury, I built a sawmill. And that mill produced enough lumber for the first settler's house. Then, shortly after, I built the grist mill. Now, before that mill was built, we had to ford the Kentucky River, carrying grain on our backs to the mills in Hopkinton, or Bosquen, or even Concord. Well, soon after, more mills were built, and we soon had the type of industry that a growing town needed. Now, of course, we Davises, we maintained our water rights. And then, sometime later, this part of town became known as Davisville, named after me. Now, when I tell you, when I say the word Davises, I mean my sons and my grandsons. I had 11 children born in Amesbury. The 9 that were still living, I brought them here.
Excuse me, good husband, but you had daughters as well as sons, and they had a mother who bore them and brought them here with her husband. Men. They tell stories about their accomplishments and forget who made it all possible. Who made the food to feed the children and the husbands? Who made the clothing? Who nursed them through dread diseases? Who looked after the farms and businesses while they were off fighting wars or arguing in the legislature? We could speak at length on this subject. Could we not, ladies? Francis, you are a kind and honorable man, and I would have you speak at length of your story to these fine people. But please remember your wife and the other ladies.
Righteously spoken, good wife Elizabeth. Now, we men didn't have the time to raise our sons or our daughters, nor tend to business. I myself was called away much often to tend to business. There were many dangers.
Many. One time, while Francis was away, the children and I were outside the cabin chopping wood and tending to the crops. That's right, we worked alongside Francis, and the work did not stop while he was away. We took on the added work if we wanted to eat come winter. At the time, there were still deadly creatures wandering the land. Our neighbor had built a trap, a bear trap, to help protect our family and our livestock. I went out to gather the cows and saw that a bear was fixing to start to escape from a trap. I picked up my axe. By that time, I was quite experienced with an axe, and yelling loudly, I ran toward him, swinging for his head. He reared up and lashed out at me and knocked the axe out of my hand. I gathered it back up and swung at him again, then stepped back quickly and gave a killing blow from the other side as he slashed at me again.
My Elizabeth, like Yael and Deborah in the Old Testament, fearlessly defending her people. Now, you might be wondering what kind of business would I be called away for? Well, I'll give you an example. In 1764, I was chosen to go to Portsmouth to officially incorporate this village. Now, His Excellency, the Governor, chose to name it Warner, and thereby the Warner River was now the name of what we call the Amesbury River. Well, I did call for the first town meeting in Warner, and I set it for Tuesday, the 4th of October, 1774, to meet at 10 o'clock in the forenoon. Now, I mentioned His Excellency, Governor John Wentworth, earlier. Governor Wentworth appointed me captain of the 22nd Company of Militia, 9th Regiment of Infantry.
He recognized that you were a leader of men, Francis. He took his responsibilities very seriously. He had the men practice and parade in the parade ground over by the meeting house in spring and in fall. Our men were well prepared when the war did come shortly thereafter.
I didn't go off to war during the War for Independence. I was just too old for fighting. But I did serve on the Committee of Safety, and I was the first state representative elected from this town. Now, in 1776, that legislature ratified our state's first constitution. Now, after the war ended, the town continued to elect me to state office until
One day in 1784, when Francis was traveling from Warner to our old hometown of Amesbury. He tried to cross a flooded creek in Derry. Both he and the horse were carried off by the flood. It was days before they found his body. They brought him back to Davisville and buried him here on the land that our son had purchased and given to the town shortly after they buried our son Payne. I followed them in death 10 years later.
Now, as I look around this cemetery and see all these granite obelisks, I'd say my family did quite well.
Yes, in our time, graves were marked by common field stones, but they have erected a granite monument to you.
Well, that monument says on it, Captain Francis Davis, pioneer. By God, that's got a nice ring to it.
What about Elizabeth Davis, pioneer? I'm the one who killed the darn bear.
Aquila Davis here, son of Francis and Elizabeth. I was just a young boy of 6 when my family moved here from Amesbury, Massachusetts. It was an exciting time. Sure, there were chores to be done, but there was still plenty of time to explore the woods, climb the hills, swim in the rivers, fish from the streams and ponds. There were sweet berries to pick and nuts to crack. Can you think of a better place a boy could call home? The town grew up right along with me. First, there were families breaking ground for planting. Pretty soon, my father had the sawmill and grist mills running. The rhythmic rasping, sawing sounds of lumber, splashes of water in the sluice powering the grist mill, and the gravelly grinding of the grain against the stone was ever bit as pretty a song as the birds in the forest to the Davis family. Of course, it's not all fun and games when you're an adult. We had to fight in a war to break free from the British. I grew up watching my father and the other men in town drill on the parade ground, so I was full of boyish romantic notions about soldiering. That soon changed. My brothers, Wells and Francis, both fought at Bunker Hill. Wells suffered from his wounds for the rest of his life. I was still eager to fight and mustered into the Army in 1777, a few months after my 17th birthday. I soon lost my boyish romanticism. I saw some rough fighting at Saratoga, Monmouth, and Newtown, and damn near froze to death at Valley Forge. But that was still soldiering. What really turned me from my romanticism was the campaign led by New Hampshire's own General Sullivan. Our orders were to go deep into Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca territory to stop the British allies from harassing the settlers. We only saw a little fighting in Newtown. The rest of the time was spent traveling from village to village, burning them to the ground, and raising acres upon acres of cornfields. Our goal was not to fight the warriors, but to starve the women and children that fled before us. I pondered those children and women often when I was at home with a full belly watching my own children play. I wonder if I could have given such a dread order as General Washington gave to General Sullivan. I do not know. But I do know that I understood the importance of being prepared for war. When I returned home, I stayed active in the military, rising to the rank of Brigadier General, and people hereabouts called me General Davis for the rest of my days. And our home, Davisville, grew finer year after year.
My family helped make these homes look grand indeed.
That they did, young Ezekiel.
My grandfather, Ezekiel Davis, he was a famous potter down in Concord. You no doubt heard about the place he lived up on Diamond Hill. My father, Ezekiel, and my uncle, Israel, they bought land down here on Palm Pond, a lot of it. And you probably heard about the place down the road called Diamond Corner. My family, they made pottery, and they made bricks, lots of bricks, to build these fine-looking homes. I farmed, everybody did really, but I had a notion to branch out a bit, so I decided to become a post rider. Notice Ezekiel Diamond, post rider. Heaven engaged a route from Concord through Hopkinton, Warner, Bradford, Fisherfield, Wendell, Newport, Croydon, New London, and Sutton. Will supply any person with a Concord Gazette and transact any business which he may be entrusted for a reasonable compensation. The route will be performed weekly, and all persons who employ him in any business may depend on his honesty and his punctuality. Warner, September 24th, 1811.
Before a year had passed, we were back at war with England. I was no longer a young man, but I understood my duty to the country and to the people in town. And so I formed the 1st Regiment of New Hampshire Volunteers in 1812, later rising to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the 45th Regiment United States Infantry.
The war made for plenty of news, but not for plenty of payments. Ezekiel Diamond, notice, post rider, informs his customers that a year will expire the last of this month since he commenced his route. He would observe to them that the printer would be wanting his damn money. A word to the wise is sufficient. He will continue his route and be grateful for all favors. September 1st, 1812.
My finest exploit in the war didn't make the papers, but that didn't stop the young men who witnessed it from spreading it around. I may have told it a time or two myself. It was towards the end of the war, at the big battle of Lake Champlain. The British thought they could march down through Canada and take the whole Champlain Valley. My orders were to keep the British ships as far from shore as possible. Now, we didn't have any big guns to be convincing, so I had to get cunning. I told my men to find logs, cut them just right, and char them black. This fooled the British, who gave our position a wide berth. Now, I'm not claiming I turned the tide of the war myself. I had a little bit of help from my men and the Navy.
Yes, sir, Aquila Davis, our own war hero. You'd think that Christ people would pay money to read about him in the paper. Notice, Ezekiel Diamond, post rider, from Concord to Newport, informs his customers that he shall discontinue his route the middle of September next, by which time he will press all persons indebted to him for papers and otherwise to make payment. off his route who owe him money will leave the money where the damn papers were left. They will perceive the necessity of settlement, and by complying with his request, save themselves a hell of a lot of unnecessary trouble. August 26, 1814.
Cheer up, young man. You're a likely lad, and Davisville is full of opportunities.
General Davis could always be trusted to give sage advice. I led a fruitful life. My farm prospered. I had a business as a cooper for a while, and I married Lydia Hardy in 1822 and sired 5 children. Although I didn't live to see it, my son Ezekiel, he went to college, and he became the first professor of the New Hampshire College of Agriculture and Mechanical Art. You'd know it today as the University of New Hampshire. Yes, sir, a fella could make a damn good living for his home here in Davisville. Thank you.
Welcome to my tavern. My name is Nathaniel Ambrose Davis. Pleased to meet you. This tavern come down the line to me as a stagecoach stop from my grandfather, Captain Davis, to my father, General Aquila, to me. After our father died in 1835, my brother James and I, we added a kitchen and carriage houses and a great big ballroom upstairs. We even put in a new sprung floor that bounced beneath the dancers' feet. We hired the best fiddler around, old Anthony Clark. He was a former slave and a Revolutionary War soldier who lived here in town. Neighbors and strangers alike would come and dance to his jolly tunes. But the true family business was lumber. Davises ran lumber in Amesbury, the colony of Massachusetts, and we brought with us ingenuity, mechanical skill, business sense, and the will to succeed. Yes, sir, Davisville was a fine place for a mill site. Why, with its natural waterfall, it seemed there was no end to the amount of water power it could provide us. I used to enjoy exploring the river bottoms when I was a boy. I would find arrowheads and Indian tools when I weren't haying or picking stones for the walls. What we needed, we built at the mill site and kept the profits in the family. We had a sawmill and a grist mill. We also had a tin yard, an iron foundry. We had a tanning yard and a woolen mill. We had a blacksmith shop and a brick yard. And of course, we were always running a farm. Seemed the only thing we didn't have was a silversmith. Well, I was feeling mighty restless and eager to see the new republic. So when my father returned home from the War of 1812, I set out. I toured through Virginia and the Carolinas. I saw Alabama and Tennessee. I even made it as far as to New Orleans. I would stop and work when I needed travel money, and I managed to become a silversmith along the way. I saw many amazing sights in my travels, but not all of them were good. I saw men, women, and children in bondage and brutalized. They had no right to life or liberty. I saw native families forced from their homes and heard of the plans to ship them even further west. Plans put forth by President Jefferson, the very man who wrote about man's inalienable rights. I was reminded of our own culpability back home in Davisville when the Abenaki families would camp in the area and sell us baskets and brooms. Well, I managed to return home just before disaster struck. The freshet of 1827 wiped the mill site clear along with the bridge. But we all pulled together and built back up again. When our father, General Aquila, died, it was up to my brothers and me. My brother James and I ran the lumber business and the grist mill. I inherited the tavern. My brother Henry stepped up to manage the farm. He was just 16 years old. We were young, but we were clever and industrious. We kept the mills and the farms running.
Nathaniel, where are the women in this history? Who was it who cooked meals for family and strangers, washed and mended clothing, tended to the bedding, washed the plates and mugs at all your merry gatherings, made the candles that lit the rooms, put up food for the winter months. Need I go on listing our contributions? And do not forget, we managed to raise children, tended to sick family and neighbors, and still found time to help on the farm. If we appear in genealogies, we are praised for our feminine qualities and raising children to live noble and useful lives. My dear sister-in-law, Alice Whittier Davis, died of consumption. She was praised in her obituary as always feminine, gracious in manner, and a devoted sister, wife, mother, neighbor, and mother to 6 children. All these things she certainly embodied, but they are hollow platitudes that gloss over women's skillful labor and the strivings of an individual woman's life.
My wife, Mary Clough Davis. It need not be said that the Davis women were also clever and industrious.
Need not be said. I would have it proclaimed loudly, lest it be forgotten.
You are right, my dear. To paraphrase the psalm, if I ever forget you, let my fingers wither and fall off like autumn leaves. Let my tongue swell and turn black if I fail to remember, if I fail to honor you as my greatest.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Times changed, though. In 1848, the railroad began to be extended from Concord to Kentucky to Warner to Bradford. It bypassed Davisville and ended visitors arriving on our door as a stagecoach stop. I must say, I was very proud to be part of the Davis family. There is a Davis adage: do all the good you can, all the time you can, for everyone that you can. Nathaniel certainly did. He studied law. People came to him for advice and mediation. He was known as fair and square. People called him Square Nats. When he left to see the new republic, he observed injustice in the land of the free. He detested those abuses and became an outspoken abolitionist. We provided safe harbor for those who came and left in the dark.
Yes, Mother. Yes, we did. Twice I saw freedom-seeking travelers kept at the tavern overnight, and there were certainly more I didn't see. My parents helped them on their way. One man had on his feet only the remnants of 6 pairs of socks. The Fugitive Slave Act required citizens to return slaves to their owners under penalty of law. Providing safe harbor was a kind yet dangerous act. Good day to you, Lucretia.
We have a house full today.
We do. It is wonderful to see so many visitors. Thank you for coming. My name is Lucretia Ambrose Davis. I was born in this town and I died in this town. If you leave here today by means of the road you call Park Avenue, you will pass my house on the right. It is a beautiful brick building. I loved that home. And I have so many wonderful memories of living in Davisville. The bed of the river was a favorite playground. There was a long ledge smoothed by the rapids with hollows where children could bathe their feet. We also swam in calm waters at the sandy beaches. We made little floating boats of wood ships and raced them down on the side next to the island. One time, a boarder found a white turtle while out boating and thought he had found a rare species. Turns out some of the Davis children had caught several turtles and painted them white. Like all the children, I attended a little schoolhouse, beginning, believe it or not, at the age of 2 terms, one in summer and one in winter. The schoolhouse had 2 doors. The girls entered on the right and the boys on the left. There was no blackboard, so one of my teachers painted on the boards of the entryway conjugated verbs and grammar essentials. Constantly before our eyes, these things were stamped on our memories. Of course, we learned by rote and reading in unison. Most of the teachers were not much older than the students themselves. In fact, I eventually taught there, as did many of my cousins. There was one teacher in particular. Her name was Mihaela Fisk. She was something. She, a teacher, would go sledding down the long hill across the river and delighted the boys. The parents did not approve of this. Mihaela boarded at my grandmother's, which is where her fiancé, John, would come visit. One night, John stayed particularly late, claiming not to have been able to find his way to the stable where his horse was. Mihaela had to go out into the snow to help him find his way. Mihaela and John were married, and they moved to Minnesota, where he milled flour and even started his own company. Did I mention that John was John Pillsbury? Yes, the company he founded was the Pillsbury Flour Company, which I believe you know even today. John also became the first governor of Minnesota and Mihaela the first lady. The Pillsburys never forgot their home in New Hampshire. They built the library in Warner, the town hall in Sutton, and the Margaret Pillsbury Hospital in Concord. Such wonderful memories of a beautiful, thriving village.
A beautiful, thriving village. Yes, but there were always risks. My own Nathaniel fell from a stack of lumber in the mill and died. My sons were young, but they stepped into their father's shoes. Henry took over the farm and his father's lumber mill at just 16 years old. They tore down the lumber yard and added a circular saw, making clapboard, shingles, and lath. They were always trying to improve production. My boys were industrious, especially Walter. That boy drove us to distraction. He never sat still. And he was always taking things apart and creating and inventing the most unique things from the parts.
My brother Walter was smart, and he could never get enough schooling. Of course, he hated like everyone else, worked on the farm and ran the grist mill, but his true motivation was to earn enough money to attend 3 academies. He excelled in mathematics and developed his mechanical skills. Naturally, Walter was a brilliant teacher at the schoolhouse, but at heart, he was an inventor. At the age of 20, he formed his first company with Samuel Dow, dealing in lumber and hemlock bark for tanneries. Over the years, partnerships came and went, they changed, but Walter always kept his whole hand in running the grist mill.
You can say that again. My hands, my mind, and my heart were all in the Davis mills. The mill yard was my playground. I explored every inch of it. If I could, I would give you a tour so you could see the wonder of it for yourself. The dam creates the drop in elevation, which increases the power in the water as it flows to the mill race. That's a narrow channel that further increases the speed of the water as it reaches the water wheel. The water leaving the water wheel flows to the tail race and then back to the river. But that power need not be wasted. That power can be reused using a penstock or a big pipe that we made out of brick. It had a series of gates so that we could divert the water to a new channel and therefore a new water wheel. Our mill yard had 3 channels running various mills. My brothers and I built a straw board mill. You may recognize straw board as the material on the inside of book covers. To increase the power of the straw board mill, we configured a 4th channel below the mill. The power generated from that was transmitted by a line of shafting that went back up to the straw board mill. It doubled the power of the mill. My mind kept churning for ways to improve production. The mill yard was a challenging puzzle. Some mills became obsolete, but as the demands of the market changed, so did we. Eventually, lumber, paper, and straw board became the major products produced at the mill yard. I invented and patented a new water wheel that increased the power by reducing the drag as it turned using a series of opposing gates that opened and closed at the appropriate time based on an internal series of cogs. We built a machine shop to manufacture the water wheel. I also had a patent on a box making machine. Meanwhile, our lumber business continued to thrive. Unfortunately, when the railroad bypassed Davisville, the labor of shipping products greatly increased. Although the railroad or the line was less than a mile from the mill, it was only a flag station. It did not have a proper loading dock. Everything produced at the mill yard, the lumber, the paper, the straw board, and the water wheels had to be loaded on wagons and driven to the train tracks and then reloaded onto the train. It made the Davisville mills less cost effective. Henry and I sold the straw board company, and I bought water rights in Kentucky and built a 3-story factory next to the river near the site of what became Reed's store, or what you all may know as that restaurant and tavern that even the dead are wondering if it will ever open. One floor was used to make my box making machine, and another floor was used by the Brainerd Silk Company.
And he built a brand new home in Kentucky for us and our children on Fountain Square. It has a tower overlooking the village.
My lovely wife, Dolly, I've spent a great deal of time talking about business, but isn't a man's wealth truly measured by the love of his family, his love for his God, and in what he gives back to his community?
And my husband and I were wealthy indeed. Walter served as president of the Kentucky Academy and curator of the Hopkinton Antiquarian Society. He was involved with the Kentucky Library and, like all Davis men, served in town and state offices. He even shepherded our spiritual lives as a speaker at the New Jerusalem Church, leading services when a preacher was not available.
The New Church, as it was called in Kentucky, was based on the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg. The teachings were similar to those of the spiritualists who were perhaps better well known. Dolly also gave much to the community as a caregiver for our ailing neighbors.
Long before and after there were doctors, we women nursed our sick family members and neighbors back to health, or made them comfortable as they went to their final rest. We looked after the needs of the families of those who were visited by illness and death as well, whether it be to sit up with their loved ones so they could find a bit of rest, or help lay the departed out for their final journey. I will admit I did hesitate to answer the call of a neighbor whose children were suffering from scarlet fever. I had 4 children of my own, and I feared something terrible would follow me home. But how could I refuse to comfort those poor little things who were suffering so? My worst fears were realized. The deepest, darkest, most foul miasma settled upon my home, and I watched, helpless, as 3 of my children suffered terribly before they were taken from us.
Our spirituality was a great comfort.
As were the neighborly women who encircled us with their loving care. That is what we did for one another. Walter and I grieved our children's deaths. were grateful that one was spared, and joyful when another was born soon after.
We grew older and marveled at the new technologies of the age. In 1897, the Kentucky Electric Company built a brick power plant downriver from the mill yard to create electricity for Warner and Kentucky. We had our house in Kentucky wired for lighting as we waited for the power to come on. Wouldn't that be an amazing sight?
Sadly, Walter died a month before the lights came on, December 13th, 1899. He would have enjoyed that night. I wonder what my inventor husband would have created with electricity. Walter's brother, Henry Davis, stripped much of the machinery from the mills in Davisville, moving it to his new paper mill in West Hopkinton and carrying on the Davis family lumber tradition. A competing company bought and closed Walter's strawboard factory. The once prosperous and progressive Davisville mills fell silent and were left empty. But the Warner River rushed on. The Kentucky Electric Company bought the water rights and the land, and the Davisville mills were razed. It was the end of an era. Walter and I had a grand life in Kentucky, but Davisville remained the home of our hearts, and so here is where we are buried, forever alongside our beloved children.
Oh my. I haven't been around this many people in quite some time. I prefer solitude. I spent my days on the shore of Tom Pond. I suppose that's why they took to calling me Henry the Hermit. I didn't start out my life shunning people. I was like most everyone else in the Davis clan. In fact, I was more Davis than most Davises. My parents were second cousins. My father descended from Captain Francis's son Zebulon, and my mother from the captain's son, General Aquila. I was surrounded by family, and I became accomplished at working with my hands, like most every Davis. I had a good business in town as a stone cutter. The boys would gather round and watch me work. I loved working with the boulders that sprang from the ground all around here. The loud, jostling boys, not so much. The rock spoke to me in a quiet, subtle way. I communicated back to it with simple tools, a chisel, a drill, wooden wedges that would swell when wet, along lines only the rock and I knew were there. The lintels that graced the Davisville doorways, sills, cornerstone, and gateposts were the result of our rapport. But I didn't have the same rapport with people. They were unpredictable, loud, demanding of attention. So in 1837, I purchased a few acres of land on the western shore of Tom Pond and began spending more and more of my days there in solitude. It was peaceful. The sound of the water lapping on the shore, the bird song, the chittering of squirrels, the quiet watchfulness of deer were a balm for my soul. Most people thought I was cracked. Some blamed it on being unlucky in love. That's what the newspapers said, but that's what the newspapers said about all the hermits in New England. If being crazy meant not wanting to live your life the way everyone else did, well, maybe I was. But for the life of me, I could never understand how folk could decide that there was one way to live, and it had to be their way. I, for one, had my own idea of living and my own notion of home, which served me till the end of my days in 1879.
Oh, you're here. Welcome, friends. I don't recognize all of you, so perhaps I should introduce myself. I'm Augusta Davis Chase. I sense the spirits are here. I shall begin. Now, please, I require quiet for my spirit writing. Cheer up. There are sounds that reach us from the spirit land. They are whispers soft and low that speak to our souls of a higher life. They come to us to let us know that they are near and to whisper, beware, when temptations around our pathway lie. They come to us often in the twilight to give us rest and peace when our daily toils are o'er and our weary souls My apologies, I seem unable to continue. I connect to the world beyond through spirit writing. Some scoff at my gift, but it is a gift that has soothed those who grieve, and it has soothed me. I've lived in Davisville almost my entire life, growing up in the brick house that my grandfather built beside the river. Life was not easy. My father, Nathan Davis, passed when I was 11. My mother struggled without his income, so she sent me to live with my aunt in Nashua. Oh, how I missed my family in Davisville. When I returned, my brother Hilliard had grown up so much. But there was much to enjoy in our little village. We visited round. We went to singing schools and dances. We attended seances and church gatherings. In the winter, there were sleigh rides and ice skating. I liked journaling and letter writing and painting and drawing, and I even taught in that one-room schoolhouse over there. Of course, there were also the courting visits. A young man named Samuel Chase began to come round. I confess I waited impatiently for his appearance. He was a delight to be around, but he was restless. Like many of the young men in our village, he was considering going out west. He wanted to work for the railroad, and he thought Wisconsin would be the place to go. Well, quite suddenly, he proposed just days before he was to leave for Milwaukee. He asked if I would leave all and follow him. Well, my mother encouraged me to accept. Oh, how I wish she had not. I was torn, but with her encouragement, I did accept. It was one of the saddest times I have ever known. I wrote about it in my journal. Our wedding day, March 2nd, 1854, was a beautiful day. Not a cloud to be seen, but there was a cloud in my heart. I fix my dress, get all things ready. I keep hoping he will not come, but he comes at 5 o'clock. I cry all the way. I try to seem brighter when we are ushered into the minister's home. I sit to the left side of Sam on the sofa. A few words makes us one. Not exactly the wedding a girl might imagine. When Sam and I arrive home, the house is dark and cold. We set up until 11 o'clock waiting. for someone to come home and congratulate us. Sam goes away 20 minutes before 3 in the morning. I held my light to the window as he left. Sam stayed with us for 2 days. He asked me to change my will to include him. I would not. He was so angry he left me again in the night, 3 days after the wedding. Sammy rises early. He reads. He doesn't say anything, eats but little, is not sociable. He suddenly says, I must go. I ask him to stay, and I tell him people don't believe we're married. He gives me the marriage certificate. He brings his horse around. He bids mother goodbye, kisses me, and shakes hands with all of us. We watch him up the hill. My expectations are blasted. I am disappointed. I feel grieved. I sit down and I cry. There were whisperings about Sam and me. A quiet wedding? What could be the reason for such a quick wedding and the sudden departure of the groom? Well, I had to prove that I was married. So I took the train all the way to Manchester and I bought a wedding cake. When we had visitors, I would serve them some cake. Our marriage mostly consisted of letters, but Sammy still referred to me as his dear wife. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, I decided to join my husband in Milwaukee. The trip grew sadder as the distance from home lengthened. The war loomed everywhere. At many of the stops, crowds would cheer the troops as they got on the trains. Shortly after arriving in Milwaukee, I became ill with typhoid fever. And Sammy hired a nurse, and I got treatment. But he was away with the railroad a lot, so my brother Hilliard came out. He thought that the reason I wasn't rallying was because I was homesick, so he brought me home to Davisville. I'd only been gone for 6 weeks. Then came a chain of sorrows. Sam enlisted. My brother Hilliard and his wife both died within a year of consumption or tuberculosis. Shortly after the war, Sam died, and when he died, he left everything to his sisters.
Oh my goodness.
So I went back to Milwaukee to contest the will, but I lost. At least I got his Army pension of $17 a month, and that did help to sustain me. But death seemed everywhere. I sought solace from Alice Hardy through trances and seances. It was then that I learned to spirit write. I lost my fear of death, and I understood that I would rejoin my loved ones in a beautiful afterlife. Sammy's name is on the gravestone with mine, as it should be. I spent the rest of my days in the beautiful brick house beside the river, amongst my blessed community of family and friends.
A marriage divided by distance. Some stayed in Davisville, but many left. The years before, during, and after the War of Secession were tumultuous, interrupting and changing industry everywhere. The railroad carried away many of our young men to new opportunities. Some returned, but most did not.
She's right. Not all of us returned. Look, first, a few words about the Davises. Look, the Davis family had the corner of the market with their mills. My sister, my mother, her second husband was a Davis. Proudly, I was not a Davis. My name is Jerome Sawyer. I did not stay in Davisville. I decided to try my luck elsewhere. Nashville. No, not really. It was Nashua to you. There were a lot of attractions there for a young man like me. It was a city. The mills paid well,
And oh my God, there were so many mill girls. They were everywhere. I married one. You give me a moment, I'll remember her name. It was Adeline. It was Adeline that I married. Now the Nashua Manufacturing Company, made cotton textiles, and it was also acquiring other mills, including the Suffolk Mill, located in Lowell. I worked my way up and I became a trader, buying the necessary materials for the mill at the right price. I was transferred to the Suffolk Mill and I settled in Chelmsford. I joined the militia there. Oh my God, after 3 years, it was horrible. I couldn't stand it. Now during this period, our first son, George Washington Sawyer, was born. But unfortunately, he didn't make it to his second birthday. Now, in the nation, the country was tearing itself apart over the question of whether or not new states should be free or slave states. There was a senator named James Hammond, and he argued before the United States Congress that the South, without raising a sword, could bring the world to its feet by cutting off the supply of cotton. He also said, "Dare you not make war on cotton? Cotton is king." Well, the northern mill owners, they panicked. What were they going to do if there was no cotton? Wisely, some northern states started to look for alternative sources of cotton. Mexico was a possibility. My wife and I moved to Mexico, and with, humbly, my vast mill experience, I became an agent for a cotton mill located in Querétaro, Mexico. I increased cotton cultivation for trade with northern states. I oversaw everything. Now, my son, Jerome, known as Geronimo in Spanish, was born in Mexico, but he didn't live for more than a month. Adeline was not well. The loss of our son harmed her deeply. I thought about it, and I considered that she would be better off with her family to nurse her back. I sent her back to Massachusetts. Now, in 1861, the Confederate States attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Almost immediately, the Northern Navy blockaded all of the ports in the South. Didn't make any difference. Trade continued. The South loaded wagons with cotton, shipped them to Texas and over the Texas-Mexico border to a Mexican port called Matamoros. Don't know why. Union Navy dared not intervene with the port of a foreign country. Now, there were many ship captains, both British and Union, who were willing to risk the blockade to buy cotton cheaply in the South and sell it high to willing northern purchasers. That old Abe Lincoln, he allowed permits to northern merchants to trade with the South. He claimed that the northern economy would collapse without access to cotton. This permitting, well, there was some oversight, but of course, it always depended on who was doing the overseeing. It certainly wasn't the Northern Union Army. The military commanders of the North were willing to personally facilitate trade between northern and southern states, so long as they could get a piece of the profits. And that even included General William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, meanwhile, trade between Mexico and the northern and southern states, it was expanding. I thought a little bit about it, and I decided I was in the right place. Now, cotton was king, but in the face of a cotton famine, in the South, they never brought the world to its feet. Now, as you all know, the War of Succession ended, but trade between Mexico and the northern states continued, with cotton gins being explained for raw cotton. Ironically, northern industry prospered during the war, and so did I. What about what's her name? Well, Adeline, she passed away in 1862. Consumption. I had no reason to return to Davisville.
I'm one of the Davises that found a different home. I'm Lloyd Granville Davis, and this is my wife, Alice Newell Davis. I had not the engineering skills of many of the people in my family. However, I did have the attributes of my grandfather and father in that I believe that all humanity is equal. I had the desire to enter ministry. I met Alice at the Biblical Seminary in New York, and we both had a desire to go into mission work.
I attended Radcliffe and was a member of the Student Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA. I spent 5 years in Calcutta. The YWCA set up schools for Indian girls, teaching them work skills and introducing them to sports, in hopes that their knowledge would eventually help them challenge the status of women in their society. It was an inspiring experience.
We traveled to the Sandwich Islands, later known as Hawaii. Sadly, many of the missionaries at that time went solely with the intent of converting the people without regard to the people or their culture. When we arrived in Honolulu, we were warmly accepted, and we grew to really appreciate the Hawaiian people.
The missions created and taught a written language system in the Hawaiian tongue, and the population became largely literate until the plantation owners overthrew the Hawaiian government, and a man named Dole from the Pineapple Empire sat as president. The United States annexed Hawaii in 1900, and then the Hawaiian language was banned and replaced with English.
The sugar in the pineapple plantations required a lot of workers, so they brought in a lot of workers from Asia. This did lead to a mix of people living in Hawaii that were well accepting of each other. Many of the Chinese Christians that came in were coming in fleeing the rebellions in China. Our church was a Kahala Union church and had services open to the Chinese as well as the Hawaiian people in the Hawaiian native language. We also opened the Christian Workers Institute with the intent of helping the plantation workers and seeking to improve their working conditions.
We also opened a Bible Institute for those who wanted to learn English and to support the ministry. We trained both young men and young women in practical and business skills. I ran a library with books available to all. Our home was always open. We became close friends with a group of Chinese parishioners who had all come from the same village in Canton.
One of the young ladies was Mary Kim, who had a desire to become a doctor. So we sponsored her to attend classes at Boston University, telling her that our family in Davisville and Kentucky would take care of her. And while she was here, she became close friends with Dorothea Preston, who was a student at Radcliffe. You might know of Dorothea. Dorothea Preston Chapin?
Mary and Dorothea enjoyed a close, long friendship with many trips between Hawaii and New England. When they were in their 90s, The Yee family brought Mary on a trip to Maine. She requested that they stop by and see Dorothea on their return. It was a delightful visit for all. Dorothea and Mary retired that evening to Dorothea's cottage behind the family house. One can only imagine the delightful conversations these longtime friends had that evening. They came to breakfast the next morning walking hand in hand.
Alice and I never did return to Davisville, but I do think it can be said that we followed and carry the Davis family adage to do all the good you can for as long as you can, for as many people as you can, and to spread that to an ever-widening world.
Many left, but there were those who moved into Davisville, including black families from other parts of New Hampshire and later on in the 1800s from down south. Don't get me wrong, Warner had black citizens right from the very beginning. Ichabod Twilight was in the very first Warner census in 1776. He fought in the Revolutionary War. More families moved here after that war. Some of them were veterans as well. William Bradish fought in the War of 1812, just like Davisville's General Aquila. James and John Haskell fought in black regiments during the Civil War. James was in the famous 54th Massachusetts that they made the movie about. All of these men are honored on Warner's Soldiers Monument. Aside from William Haskell, the noted basket maker, Warner's black citizens usually worked as laborers, hostlers, and domestic servants, the kind of work that formed the backbone of the community. Black children attended Warner schools in whichever part of town the families resided, such as Waterloo, the School Street School right downtown Warner, and right here in Davisville, of course. But let me tell you about the Moody families coming to Davisville. Mary Moody was born Mary Rosanna Haskell in Bow in 1840. Her parents moved her and her sister to Chichester when they were young. She married a shoemaker named Charles Moody, and they lived in Pittsfield. Pittsfield was known for its shoe industry back then. When that petered out, Charles turned to farming. In 1875, Mary and Charles were living in Pembroke when Josie Langmaid, a teenage girl, was brutally murdered. Charles was arrested solely because he was the only black man in town. Fortunately, the actual killer was caught. Charles and Mary moved on from Pembroke. By 1891, Mary was living in Davisville with 6 of their 8 children. There were black families in Chichester, Pittsfield, Northfield, Loudon, Hopkinton, in practically every city and small town in New Hampshire. The Moodys probably knew many of them and were related to many of them. Those families were their community, their home, more than any town or village they lived in. The Moodys lived in Davisville on what became known as Poverty Plains Road, named so because they lived there. You can imagine the racial slur some of the locals used to refer to the road and to them. But they had each other. Mary was the matriarch of a large extended family teeming with children and grandchildren. They were her joy. They were her home. The Davises welcomed black men's work in the mills as laborers and firemen. Wealthier families in town relied on black women's domestic labor, women that were born and raised in New Hampshire, and women sent north by the Freedmen's Bureau after the Slaveholders' Rebellion. Their children could attend school, but they were not welcomed by all. They were needed, but not wanted. Choosing a home
but not being fully a part of it. That was the paradox of being black in this country. Is it different now?
I knew Mrs. Moody from the days when we took care of paupers for the town. The town paid Mrs. Moody to look after the widow Ryan for a spell. The town paid me for the groceries that Mrs. Moody bought for the widow Ryan in my store. I'm Moses Trussell, and I wasn't always a grocer, mind you. In my younger days, I worked as a mechanic in the Davis sawmill, and I was married to a local girl, Mary Stevens. Now, you've heard about the train that passed Davisville by, and the mills started leaving, and people were leaving, even Mary. She died when we were still quite young. But things took a turn for the positive. I met and married my second wife, Susan Airy, in 1875, and we took over the Davisville corner store. Now, Moses, you might well ask, why would you do a fool thing like become a grocer when everyone and everything was leaving Davisville? I'll tell you why. Davisville was changing, but it wasn't dying. There was a new industry sweeping the land: tourism. Local families added rooms and whole floors to their houses to welcome summer boarders. Boarders and boarding houses needed groceries and household goods and souvenirs and postcards. I even became Davisville's first postmaster to make sure that local folks and summer visitors could easily send and receive mail. Susan and I did well. We bought the store from the Davises. And the Trussell General Store was a Davisville monument until we died. First me in 1912, and then Susan in 1919.
That's when my husband, Oakman Weber, and I moved from Massachusetts with our son, Robert, and bought the Davisville store. We also owned the cottage next door, and at the beginning, Oakman worked as a machinist and Robert helped me in the store. Once we bought the cottage next door, we were able to add rooms to the cottage as well as over the store. Robert was as handy a builder as was his father. Robert built our famous dance pavilion that hung out over the river.
Hello, Augusta. Entertaining guests?
Why, hello, Mary. What do you think? Should we reserve some rooms for them? Mary Sanborn and her husband, Joseph, took in summer boarders at their farmhouse, which they called Hillcrest.
We were in the boarding house business before 1910 when the Trussells had the store. We owned land all the way down the Davisville Road and river, including all the land around this cemetery. We sold a piece of land to the town to build the schoolhouse right over there. Our farm, which we called Hillcrest, used to belong to Zebulon Davis a long time ago. Jerome Sawyer and his mother lived there before he went off to Nashua and Mexico.
connections cross town borders into Hopkinton and Webster. My name is Abigail Jerry. I was born into the Rand family in 1849. My father moved us to Hopkinton when I was small, and he worked for a while as a miller. We moved back to Davisville when he bought a farm here.
And I whisked her away to Concord after we were married. Reuben Jerry here. I was a railroad man at the time, and I couldn't but help to notice all the people coming up more and more from the cities to rest and relax in the relative calm of these small towns in southern New Hampshire. And I just couldn't help thinking how these people, these tourists, needed a place to sleep and food to eat and recreation and entertainment.
So Reuben bought a grand house on Putney Hill in Hopkinton in 1881, and he fixed it up for boarders. Most boarding houses at that time just took in summer visitors, but Reuben built a large dance hall so that we could have winter sleighing parties. We had guests all year round, and we were known for our sleighing parties. We were also known for our dog, Prinny. She was perhaps the most important member of our staff. We loved her so much and couldn't bear to be parted from her. So when she passed, we buried her in our own little family plot.
Put her name right on the stone. Our ideal life came to a crashing halt one cold January night in 1904 when a raging fire took out the house and the dance hall and shed and barn. We weren't able to save hardly anything.
But the guests were saved. No one was hurt, thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
So Reuben went back to work for the railroad, and sadly he died a few short years later. I went to work as a housekeeper, and when I retired, I moved in with my daughter. The work wasn't all that different from what I'd done at the boarding house. But you know, sometimes I would catch the glint of freshly falling snow, and it would bring me back to those days of sleighing parties and gay laughter.
The Davisville boarding houses were just beginning when yours was ending. We had Hillcrest, Fanny Shirtliff had Sunnyside, and Jetty and Homer Davis ran Riverside.
And who could forget the Glendon, just down the road near the Hopkinton town line? Herbert and Mary Jane Bean turned their poultry farm into the great commoner summer resort in New England.
Yes. We were catering to a different class of tourists. Middle class, even working class, not the rich people who summered in the White Mountains.
Vacations weren't just for the rich anymore. No need to come to New Hampshire for months every summer. Even shopkeepers and teachers could afford to take a couple weeks off and get away from it all.
We should pause here to admit that everyone wasn't welcome in our houses. Obviously, there weren't any black tourists. In the 19th century, Irish could work for us, but weren't expected to vacation here.
Catholics, which meant Irish and newer immigrants, were welcome in places such as the Amesbury and the Glendon in the 1900s. Thank you. The Glendon's guests donated a stained glass window to the Catholic Church in Kentucky.
But there were houses in both?
There, and there were in both Warner and Hopkinton who advertised that they were for Gentiles only. That meant no Jews in their establishment.
Those who were welcome
welcome could take day excursions by train, carriage, and eventually automobile to enjoy the natural beauty of Mount Kearsarge, the Mink Hills, and Lake Sunapee. Not to mention the natural beauty and recreational opportunities of our own Warner River, Tom Pond, and Pleasant Lake. Our guests could swim, boat, fish, and kick up their heels 4 nights a week.
Yes, Hugh Flanders and his band played for 2 nights at the Amesbury and 2 nights at the Glendon. There was more dancing and swimming up the road at Pleasant Lake. Bowling too. Or you could stay on premise and play horseshoes, table tennis, croquet, or badminton.
The good fresh food from our farms and gardens was also a big draw. We had fresh meat, vegetables, and fruit all summer long. Fresh food was a little more scarce in the winter once the visitors had gone.
We've forgotten to mention the unspoken but fervently hoped for activity of the summer. Love.
Abigail, really?
Augusta, you must admit that couples did meet each other in the boarding houses.
With young men and women living in close quarters, it was bound to happen.
Boarding house weddings and honeymoons were not that uncommon in our heyday in the 1920s and 30s. We provided all the services so they felt like they were in their second home.
Well, I guess you're right. I do remember a wedding at the Glendon between Helen Brucker and Charles Spiegel, who had summered there. My step-granddaughter, Jeanette, came to live with us in the 1930s. She could play and entertain the visitors with her swimming antics when she was a child. But as Oakman and I grew older, we relied on her to wait tables and work in the store. She helped her grandfather sell candy, ice cream, cold drinks, all the treats visitors could want except alcohol. No booze was sold in our store. Jeanette pumped gasoline and lit the street lamps in the evenings. The year of her high school graduation, I handed her the keys to the store. Her mother helped her stock it, and they both stayed in the back room for the summer. The Glendon, Oakman and I retired in 1941, and both the Amesbury and the store continued with its own new owners. The Glendon was renamed the Scandinavian by its new owners when the Beans retired. John and Mary Warren honeymooned at the Amesbury, then returned with their children every summer until it closed. Then they went and stayed at the Flagstone across the street until it closed. Then they went and stayed at the Scandinavian. Eventually, it closed too.
Vacations were changing once again. People didn't want to stay in one place when they could drive to their destinations. Boarding houses were replaced by motor inns. We closed Hillcrest in 1937 after my husband Joseph ended his life. I don't think he wanted to live through another big change in his older years. But he did have the foresight before he left us to buy some land sell some land on the east bank of Tom Pond for individual summer cottages, a real second home for the summer. But I wonder if they could have had the same camaraderie that our boarding house guests had.
Well, my parents bought a cottage on the west side of Tom Pond, and I spent many, many summers there. And I can say most emphatically that, yes, we had a great sense of camaraderie, of community. Hello, I'm Nancy Nickel McNeil. development that was yet another response to the changing expectations of tourists and summer visitors to the area, when in 1928, Arthur Hardy divided some of his family's land into small lots. He referred to them as camps. Families who purchased these camps returned summer after summer to enjoy being on the water and being with friends. Even after marrying my husband Charles McNeil and moving down to Maryland and even later to Florida, we always returned to Tom Pond. I felt a sense of responsibility to protect not just our property, but the whole pond. And fortunately, many of our neighbors agreed. So to that end, in 1988, we established the Tom Pond Protective Association, dedicated to the protection and preservation of the water quality. I serve as president of the association, as a member of the board, and as editor of the newsletter at various times. I also learned the importance of regularly monitoring the water quality and learned about water testing when I participated in the New Hampshire Volunteer Lake Assessment Program, from which I received a certificate of recognition for all my volunteer work. Tom Pond was home, and I stayed active until my death in 2000. Charles and I chose this cemetery to be our final resting place, and we proudly proclaim on our monument that we are McNeil of Tom's Pond.
So now we come full circle back to my people, who were the first to greet the newcomers who came to settle this land. Many fled in a diaspora that spread us far. Some settled on a reserve in Quebec. Others stayed in community with the settlers to form this new nation together. Guy Schoolcraft, one of the latter, is buried here. Guy lived all over our homeland we call Indocumene. Born in Quebec in 1908, he grew up in Vermont and came to Vermont in 1930. Came to Warner in 1930. In Vermont, he was a farmhand. In Warner, a plumber, and he worked at the box factory. Guy didn't have family here, but he had close friends who welcomed him, and their children called him Uncle. In Native families, it's frequent that the children will call close family friends auntie and uncle. It shows respect. It warmed Guy's heart that the children called him uncle. It made it more like home. Guy grew old here in Davisville. He was ill at the end of his life, and so he decided it was time to move on. He would lay his pain aside. He didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Guy rests here now in Davisville, where he lived for over 40 years and where our ancestors made their home for over 12,000 years.
Home. It's where we feel a sense of belonging. Home reflects our values, our identities. There were many types of homes in Davisville. Homelands that, yes, were wrested away from others. Homes that were carved from the woodland. Homes that were lived in only down through the generations. Homes that were left, but always remembered. Homes that were set apart from others by choice or by prejudice. Homes defined by bounds of love. I'd like to read a few words from my memoir about my home in Davisville. This little hamlet